Hey everybody, Johnny the Queer POTUS here, and I'm so excited because today I'll be presenting my first ever collaboration with another history YouTuber. For the past 6 months, I've been working on a project with Alki Historiker, a fantastic YouTuber who focuses on labor history and is famously fond of the bottle as well. In this video, we combined our strengths, Alki's being labor history and mine being presidential history, to bring you this amazing story of one of the largest strikes in American history. So sit back and enjoy the tale of Rutherford B. Hayes and the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. As always, don't forget to like this video. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and also subscribe to Alki's channel. There are a whole bunch of amazing videos you can binge watch right after this one on my channel and on his, so don't miss your chance to join the fun. Alright, now that we've gotten through all of that, take it away, Alki.
In the summer of 1877, a series of dramatic strikes broke out across the northeastern United States, which would come to be known as the Great Railroad Strikes. They burst out in Baltimore and Pittsburgh, along the line stretching from West Virginia to Ohio and beyond the Mississippi River. They pulled in conductors, ticket punchers, and comrades from trades like coal mining and steelworking. Strikers blocked trains, burned railroad property, and brought the American transportation system to its knees. What was unleashed in the summer of 1877 would go down in the annals of history as the closest the United States has ever come to a national general strike and working class revolution. But these events didn't come out of thin air. They were the outcome of a 5-year period of economic downturn. A financial panic in 1873 kicked off by railroad financier Jay Cooke, who speculated wildly with investor money and exaggerated returns, had plunged the country into a depression so bad it became known as the Great Depression. Cooke's schemes led to the sudden failures of thousands of banks and businesses. Right off the bat, railroad construction slowed to a crawl, to 6,000 miles between 1873 and 1877 compared to 35,000 in 1865 alone. And within the first year, roughly 500,000 railroad jobs vanished into thin air. Those who didn't lose their jobs were severely underemployed, hit with a hefty wage reduction, and were often paid irregularly. Most of the railroad industry in 1873 was not unionized, and the 3 unions that existed were divided by craft, limiting their overall effectiveness. Workers turned to these railroad brotherhoods, such as the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, for support, but the leadership of these unions differed on the opinion of tactics. The more militant rank-and-filers wanted to strike for a living wage, while the leaders of the BFLE were much more conservative and did not approve of strikes. Undeterred, the rank-and-file members chose to explore new tactics and methods of organizing that would characterize organized labor on the railroads during the late 19th century. These new tactics included wildcat strikes, sabotage, and industrial unionism, which contrasted with the more conservative and traditional strikes approved by union leadership and craft unionism. It's these new organizing techniques that foreshadowed the Great Railroad Strikes.
1876 would prove to be a dramatic year, not just for labor history, but also for presidential politics. The nation's first centennial would see the most divisive election in its history. Since the end of the Civil War, Republicans, the party of Lincoln, had won every single presidential election. With much of the South still under military occupation, and many former Confederates ineligible to vote, the Democrats, whose voter base consisted largely of Southern whites, remained in the political wilderness. But the years of corruption and scandal under outgoing President Ulysses Grant and the economic crash of 1873 had diminished the Republican standing and created a lane for a Democrat to win the White House for the first time since 1856. Amnesties for ex-Confederates had re-enfranchised much of the white voter base in the South, while Klan terrorism and other intimidation tactics suppressed the reliably Republican black vote. With the Civil War now a decade in the rearview mirror, the election of 1876 was anybody's game. One of the chief issues of the 1876 campaign would be anti-corruption, and Democrats ran a reform candidate, New York Governor Samuel Tilden. The Republicans followed suit by nominating one of its own reformers, Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes is one of our more forgotten presidents, but his life was anything but forgettable. He was a 5-time wounded general during the Civil War, and he had served in some of the war's toughest fighting, including the bloodiest day in U.S. history, the Battle of Antietam. After his service, he entered politics, winning 2 terms as Ohio's governor. During his time in office, Hayes became known for efficient government and anti-corruption policies, but he considered getting Ohio to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments his proudest achievements. These were post-Civil War changes to the Constitution, aimed at giving Black Americans equal protections under the law and voting rights. With those two amendments passed, Hayes believed his mission in politics had reached its end.
I mean to be out of politics. The ratification of the 15th Amendment gives me the boon of equality before the law, terminates my enlistment, and discharges me cured.
Retirement didn't last long. In 1875, the Republicans nominated him for a third term as governor of Ohio. By now, Hayes had switched his focus from the passage of civil rights legislation to civil service reform. His reform platform won him the governorship, and his victory was soon noticed by the National Republican Party. Months into his term, Hayes found himself the GOP nominee for President of the United States. Election Day 1876 came and went with no clear winner. Several states had sent electors for both candidates to the Electoral College, creating a constitutional crisis. The American public was held in suspension from Election Day all the way until the weekend before inauguration, which in those days was not January 20th, but March 4th. Imagine the 2000 election between George Bush and Al Gore, but longer and even more screwed up. With only days left and no president-elect, the Senate agreed to form a bipartisan committee to decide who won the election. Days before inauguration, a deal was made to elect Rutherford Hayes president. As part of the deal, Hayes would agree to serve one term. He would also agree to remove all Union troops who had been occupying the southern states since the end of the Civil War. Reconstruction would formally end. Hayes accepted the terms, and with them, the nation's highest office. As you can imagine, Hayes' legitimacy as president was constantly questioned due to the nature of how he was elected, or perhaps more accurately, appointed president. He endured nicknames like His Fraudulency and Rutherford B. Hayes for the rest of his life. But as he seized the reins of power, he took little time to brood on such setbacks. One of the greatest challenges of his presidency was already unfolding before him.
As railroad failures continued into May of 1877, 4 railroads agreed to cut wages and cover each other in the event of a strike at any one company. Never before had railroad capitalists organized themselves against labor in this way. Beginning with the Missouri Pacific in mid-May, railroad after railroad announced 10% wage cuts that would go into effect in June or July. Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad instituted double headers in addition to the wage cut for those making more than $1 that took effect on June 1st. A double header meant that the number of train cars would be doubled per train, while the amount of crew would remain the same, effectively requiring double the work for the same amount of crew. It was not long after that Baltimore and Ohio Railroad executives approved CEO John W. Garrett's proposal for the doubleheader and the 10% wage cut effective July 16th, the second in less than a year. While the company had struggled at points during the Depression, at no point did the executives lower their salaries or the 10% dividends going towards shareholders, instead choosing to cut wages on the B&O, to the point that these workers were some of the lowest paid in the industry. They were so confident that workers would cheerfully concur with their decision that they canceled the rest of their board meetings for the summer in order to start their vacation early. Their mentality can best be summed up in a quote from the Commercial and Finance Chronicle. This year, labor is under control for the first time since the war. It was this final wage cut that broke the camel's back for most railroad workers, especially on the Baltimore and Ohio. A strike broke out at Camden Junction on July 16th, the date the wage cut and doubleheaders went into effect. A fireman left his locomotive and was quickly joined by other firemen. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad quickly hired scabs, but the strikers chose to remain in the junction, and a crowd of workers from various railroad trades quickly formed. In Martinsburg, West Virginia, on the same day, a much larger strike had broken out. A large crowd of townspeople joined them as well. They quickly formed a blockade, refusing to allow any freight to pass through the city and prevented any strike leaders from being arrested. The local militia was sent in, but largely ineffective. Many militiamen had friends and family who worked on the railroads, and some of them even worked for the railroads themselves.
With the situation sliding out of control, B&O President Garrett frantically urged West Virginia Governor Henry Matthews to wire President Hayes and ask for federal troops.
The loss of an hour would most seriously affect us, and imperil vast interests.
Governor Matthews requested 200 Marines from the president. Hayes was reluctant. Although he was personal friends with many railroad magnates, and even owned stock in railroad companies, he was acutely aware of how easy it was for a president to become a puppet for the railroad interests. That didn't mean he stood with the strikers, though. Hayes was, after all, a former military man who believed in discipline and loyalty even when conditions were at their worst. And he was particularly against the tactic of preventing strikebreakers from working.
Every man has a right, if he sees fit to quarrel with his own bread and butter, but he has no right to quarrel with the bread and butter of other people. Every man has a right to determine for himself the value of his own labor, but he has no right to determine for other men the value of their labor.
Hayes took a middle position, which meant he'd be reluctant to unleash the full muscle of the military on the strikers. But his diary entry also reveals a basic misunderstanding about what makes strikes successful. What good is it to go on strike if someone else can just come in and replace you? In order to win against these massive railroad tycoons, the strike had to be enforced by intimidation or violence if necessary. Hayes' attitude would thus ultimately work to the railroad company's advantage, regardless of his own desire not to be controlled by them. As Martinsburg continued to burn, Hayes finally ordered every available soldier from the Washington Arsenal and Fort McHenry in Baltimore to go put down the strike.
By the time the soldiers arrived, things had mostly calmed down, but now the B&O strike in Baltimore was flaring up again. This time, the strikers were joined by boatmen on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, coal miners, iron workers, and factory employees. Said one striker,
"The working people everywhere are with us. They know what it is to bring up a family on 90 cents a day, to live on beans and cornmeal week in and week out, to see the wife breaking down under the privation and distress, and the children growing sharp and fierce like wolves day after day because they don't get enough to eat."
Soon violence broke out. As the militia arrived at the scene of a riot in Cumberland, Maryland, they were stoned by a mob. Troops fired into the crowd, killing 10 men and boys. At the depot where the governor, police chief, and various officials had sheltered, a mob of 15,000 surrounded them. Hayes wired to Fort McHenry again to muster all available troops. As events in Baltimore unfolded, unrest among Pennsylvania railroad workers began to spark some activity as well. They too had endured the wage cuts and speedouts of the past years. Many Pennsylvania workers still held fresh the memory of an execution of 10 members of a group called the Molly Maguires earlier that year. The Molly Maguires were a secret society who, among other things, attempted to organize Irish coal miners in Pennsylvania. For the workers in Pennsylvania, the execution of the Mollies showed the power of capital to disrupt labor organizing and how local and state governments were in the pockets of capitalists. On July 19th, Pennsylvania Railroad announced a decision to start doing doubleheaders on all eastbound trains. A strike was imminent.
President Hayes monitored events from his summer residence at the Soldiers' Home, miles outside the city. The house had once been a refuge for Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. Now it was a refuge for a president facing a revolt of a wholly different nature. Hayes' intervention at Martinsburg was widely praised, but the experience had revealed an uncomfortable truth. The army was in no condition to put down a general rebellion. When the rebellion which led to the Civil War first began, the army was very small. But after the rebel attack on Fort Sumter, Lincoln managed to raise a massive army of volunteers at record speed. Through subsequent drafts and the inclusion of black soldiers, the U.S. Army's size had ballooned to over 2 million men. But the end of the war in 1865 would be the beginning of one of the largest demobilizations in history. By the time President Hayes enters the story, the Army stood at a mere 25,000 regulars. Most of those were out west fighting Indian bands at the behest of the railroad industries who were building rail lines over indigenous lands. Weeks before the strike, a war broke out in the Wallowa Valley of Washington state between the Nez Perce and the U.S. Army. In terms of what was available to Hayes on the eastern seaboard in the summer of 1877, we're talking a maximum of 6,000 regulars. That's it. So Hayes would have to be very judicious in his use of his troops. On July 20th, he relented to pressure from Baltimore and sent 500 Marines to put down the riots. But before they arrived, order was restored, and they were called back. Throughout this entire process, Hayes would often send troops to places only to pull them back at the last minute after news had reached him that order was restored. And the constant shuffling of troops across railroad lines intimidated railroad workers and gave them an inflated sense of how many soldiers the president actually had at his command.
Meanwhile, strikes in Pennsylvania were ramping up. Strikers blocked all eastbound freight and refused to allow any trains to pass through their depots. Crowds gathered at switches to prevent trains from being diverted to other lines. With the strike in full swing, the Trainmen's Union called Pennsylvania Railroad to the table. They demanded an end to the double headers and reversing the June wage cut. Railroad Vice President Alexander Cassett refused to negotiate, instead calling for a crackdown. In Pittsburgh, the local militia were sent to suppress the strike. But to Cassett's amazement, the soldiers began fraternizing with the strikers. Many were friends and neighbors of the rail workers, and their own pay had been cut in these trying times. Unrest and demonstrations erupted in several cities from Harrisburg to Altoona. In Pittsburgh, the militia killed 20 people while trying to reclaim the streets, only to further enrage the strikers. 20,000 people took to the streets, burning down the roundhouse along with other railroad property and destroying 2,152 rail cars. In Reading, enraged strikers protesting against the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad learned that the militia was moving across the state. The strikers used coal, oil, and cotton to set the Lebanon Valley Bridge ablaze in an attempt to stop the militia. The bridge was completely destroyed. The following day, the Pennsylvania National Guard fired upon a crowd of strikers in Reading. The casualties numbered up to 16 people, second only to Pittsburgh.
As the strike spread into Pennsylvania, Hayes continued to receive dispatches urging him to send troops. Pennsylvania Railroad President Tom Scott wired Hayes, demanding he call up a volunteer army, as Lincoln had done during the Civil War. No doubt many a president has been swayed by the thought of being a Lincoln, but Hayes, who'd bled during the rebellion, was not anxious to lead the country down that path, unless there was no other choice. Scott's telegram went unanswered. As the strike spread, violence erupted in Philadelphia, Erie, and Hornsville, New York, where strikers even began to stop passenger trains. Strikers in Ohio soon joined in. By July 24th, there were strikes in Missouri and Iowa as well. Gradually, the situation stabilized in Pennsylvania, as state and federal responses became more organized and coordinated. Conflagrations in Chicago and St. Louis, even San Francisco, would call for some small dispatches of troops, but by the end of July, the strikes appeared to be winding down. Even so, railroad executives pleaded with Hayes not to let down his guard. As late as July 31st, Tom Scott wired,
"Please do not be misled by any news of a peaceable settlement of existing troubles. The removal of military in all probability will be followed by renewed outbreaks."
The press also leaned very heavily on Hayes. Newspapers continued sensationalizing events, warning that a communist uprising was imminent, and even going so far as to invoke the Paris Commune of 1871. The Paris Commune of 1871 was a dramatic but short-lived proletarian uprising in France that had become a byword in the United States for disorder and violence. Descriptions of the horrors of revolution were still fresh in the minds of many Americans who read the sensationalist newspaper accounts of the time. A red panic was poised to sweep through the land. Hayes, who regarded communism as a destabilizing scheme, did not see the hand of Karl Marx in the recent strikes.
I do not regard the present disorders as evidence of the prevalence of a spirit of communism, since their attacks had not been primarily directed against property in general, but merely against that of the railroads with which the strikers had difficulties.
The portrayal of strikers as radical communards chipped into their support among the broader public. The strikers didn't have access to the editorial rooms of the country's major newspapers. Lack of access to mediums of public communication prevented them from telling their side of the story. Lack of communication within their own ranks made it difficult for them to coordinate their actions. This disadvantage was partly due to the nature of their strike. The two principal ways information about the strike spread was through word of mouth and telegraph lines. Once the rails were blockaded, trains generally did not move from one town to the next, and telegraph lines were disabled. So while an estimated 80,000 railroad workers and 500,000 people participated in the strike spanning from Baltimore to San Francisco, the strikers were not unified or organized in a way where they could demand concessions from multiple railroads. This strike was nationwide in scale, but not in effort. The strike failed to reverse the wage cuts. Afterwards, most strikers returned to work for starvation wages, though hundreds were fired or blacklisted for strike activities. The railroad companies then used their influence to have hundreds arrested across the nation. While some faced prison or workhouse sentences, most workers were fined or had their charges dropped altogether, much to the discontent of the railroads. In the following months, railroad CEOs and state governments reorganized militias and national guards and increased their resources to ensure that future strikes would be put down swiftly. But they also understood that preventing strikes in the first place would be necessary. The railroads accepted that workers went on strike to protest their subsistence wages and harsh working conditions. Some introduced changes to working conditions, created new benefits, and even reduced the wage cut. It was ultimately the 10% wage cuts that left American railroad workers in such a position they felt the need to strike. Naturally, these weren't the only people who felt exploited. Many of these towns had considerable populations of unemployed workers. Those who were employed were typically underemployed, often spending months at a time without work and underpaid to the point where they could barely support their families. In some cases, single men did not earn enough to support themselves. These people were the victims of the Depression, which they blamed on the rampant speculation of railroad companies in the years leading to the Panic of 1873. This is why so many workers in other industries supported the strikers and refused to be strike breakers for the railroad officials. From the perspective of capitalists, this strike was harder to break thanks to the lack of strike breakers. Their efforts were further hindered by the amount of law enforcement within cities. Local police did not have enough officers that were willing to confront protesters, and several cities had only a handful of police to begin with because the Depression left cities with small budgets. When city mayors attempted to bring in local militias, they ran into all sorts of problems. For starters, many of the men within militias worked on the railroads or had family or friends who worked for the railroads. Many simply sympathized with the struggles that the men were facing and did not want to confront them at all. It was largely for this reason that militias from other parts of the state had to be brought in, and even that wasn't effective in the case of Pittsburgh. In some cases, the strikers had basically won and were ready to arbitrate with railroad officials. Nevertheless, railroad officials refused to arbitrate with the strikers under any circumstance. They saw any form of arbitration as a challenge to their authority.
Hayes's measured response to the strike provoked a massive pressure campaign on the administration, led by the railroad managers and their allies in the press. Over the course of 8 days, 9 governors begged Hayes to send troops at the behest of the railroad companies. For railroad magnates who had gotten used to the army being at their beck and call, Hayes was a disappointment. Many of them became nostalgic for the Grant years, when railroad interests could always count on the unquestioning support of their commander-in-chief. Grant himself spoke out.
That strike should have been put down with a strong hand, and so summarily as to prevent a like occurrence for a generation.
Hayes even drew the disdain of prominent cultural figures. Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, a champion of abolition during the Civil War, called the railroad strikers tyrants, opposed to law and order, and insisted on reminding his congregation that God intended the great to be great and the little to be little. But most people rejected this view and saw in the strikes an opportunity to ask difficult but important questions. Why did these workers strike? Why did the other workers join them? Some in Congress, and even in Hayes' own cabinet, began calling for an investigation to address the causes of the riots. A public curiosity about conditions for American workers spread across the populace, even finding its expression in the pages of Hayes' diary on August 5th.
The strikes have been put down by force, but now for the real remedy. Can something be done by the education of the strikers, by judicious control of the capitalists, by wise general policy to end or diminish evil? An attempt to probe and soothe the labor difficulties by means of a commission under public instructions would of itself do good and might promise really valuable results.
The age of reform found its early voice in this period, though it would be stifled in the opulent days of the 1880s. Hayes did little in his 4 years to follow up on his plans for labor reform. His administration was dominated by a messy and ill-fated attempt to institute civil service reform, which divided the government and his own party. A period of extreme economic inequality known as the Gilded Age followed his single term in office. Workers' strikes were put down with increasingly greater speed and heavier violence, while railroad magnates continued to rake in massive profits through speed-ups, double-headers, and all the various ways they squeeze labor power out of the workforce. As their profits grew, so did their influence on political power. Late in life, Hayes looked back at his experience in politics, identifying what he believed to be the greatest threat to the interests of a free nation.
I am convinced that the giant evil and danger in this country, the danger which transcends all other, is the vast wealth owned or controlled by a few persons. Government must prevent the accumulation of vast fortunes, and monopolies should be held firmly in the grip of the people.
While this event is typically referred to as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, it is important to note that many of the strikers did not work on the railroads. In fact, most of those arrested in connection with the strike lived very close to the railroads but were not employed by them. Most were simply working class people who lived in the vicinity and were interested in the commotion. Others came out after local police or the militia mobilized to confront the strikers, though many militiamen and even officers sympathized with the strikers. They chose to lay down their weapons or, in some cases, give the workers guns or ammunition. When the local militia chose to fire upon the strikers, killing not only railroadmen but also women and children, whole communities joined the strike to confront the militia, while also sabotaging the railroads to keep scads from getting the trains moving again. How exactly workers organized themselves during this is still a mystery, but they were in fact organized. The tactics used were certainly well understood by the strikers. They knew that if a relatively few amount of workers went on strike at key points, the entire rail network could be shut down. We see that at Camden Junction, a place where trains had to travel to if they wanted to head west. This allowed the strike to grow as workers upset by the wage cut were unable to work and joined the strike. They overcame the struggles of division of trade, skill level, union versus non-union, and even race in order to create not just a strike, but a complete insurrection. While this insurrection failed to immediately improve the wages of railroad workers, it succeeded in reinvigorating socialist and organized labor. For socialists, it demonstrated the need for political action, inspiring workingmen's parties to form and field candidates. For the labor movement, it reminded them of the importance of organization leading to an increase in union membership. Though this uprising was put down, it was the origin point for the serious socialist movement and labor movement of the late 19th century, movements which still inspire and empower us to this day.
Thanks everyone for watching today, and I want to give a special thanks to Alki Historiker for hitting me up and pitching this collaboration idea to me. It took us some time, but we were able to come up with a really cool video in the end, and I'm so glad that we were able to do that. Please, if you liked this video, go over to Alki's channel right now and hit subscribe. Go binge every one of his videos. They are amazing. And you know, while you're at it, why don't you hit subscribe on this channel right now. Go ahead, beep, 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 hit that subscribe button, all right? And go donate to Alki's Patreon as well, because Alki's content is absolutely fantastic. So thanks everyone for watching today, and I wish you a wonderful day.